the biggest challenge to Moses was not actually speaking to Pharaoh. The biggest challenge was speaking to his own people. Because he says in verse 13, Moses said to God, "Behold, when I come to the children of Israel and say that the God of your fathers has sent me, they will say, 'What is his name?'" And of course, this raises the big question, because God says, "Say, I am that I am." And then God says, "Say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of Abraham, of Isaac, has sent you. And then gather the elders and say to them, the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, of Jacob has appeared." Now, this is quite significant, because he's having to take a very strong stand and exercise leadership. But then he comes into the problems, because if I turn a bit farther down, when I go to the king of Egypt, I'm absolutely sure that the king will not let them go. And God even confirms that and says, "I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, not by a mighty hand." So the evidence here is that what Moses is called to do is impossible. And for even God to admit in verse 19 that it's impossible, then this is quite serious. So what God says in answer in verse 20, "I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst." After that, he'll let you go. So it's very significant. There comes a time when God has to demonstrate his power to the unbeliever. And I believe that that's even important in the presentation of the gospel. And as an evangelist, I've always been aware of this fact, that there needs to be some clear demonstration of who and what God is. Which is why in my evangelism, I've always sought to pray with the sick and to see and expect to see and see instant miracles. Whereas in a church situation, you pray with the sick, and sometimes the answer may take weeks or months or even years to come to pass, although nonetheless it's still an answer. But I found very much in evangelism that what I have to do is demonstrate to the very people that I'm talking to the power of God. So what I do is, because of the vast numbers, I mean, when you've got 10,000 people, you can't pray for every one of them individually. I learned this a long time ago. And also because in Kiev, the government became so angry with me, and in trying to stop me preaching and evangelize, they said I could not actually pray with the sick unless I had a license from my own British government stating that I was a faith healer. Well, you can laugh at that, as I did. And so in seeking the Lord, I said, Lord, there must be a way in which we can get round it. And the Lord gave me quite clear instructions. And the instruction is very simple. First of all, to declare that I am not a healer, which is true. To declare that God is the only healer. To pray with the people, to teach them how to pray, so that in the end they are praying. And then God said to me, I will confirm this with signs and wonders and miracles. And so what happens when I turn to the people and I say, look, I'm not a healer, I'm not a healing evangelist, I can't heal you, only God can. And I said, I'll show you how to pray. You pray, lay your hands on your sickness in accordance with the command of Jesus, and you'll be healed. They do it. And then I ask them, now test and see that the miracle has happened, and come up on the platform and tell us what God has done. And the amazing thing is that every time I do this, people come flocking up to the platform. Sometimes we have a big crowd coming up. Sometimes they're a little bit shy. But People coming up and witnessing and testifying of healing of blindness, deafness, broken legs, broken arms, cancers. But the evidence is there and they demonstrate it. And I can remember on one occasion having people coming up who'd had broken legs through accidents and saying to them, now, if God has worked this miracle, jump off the platform. And they do it. And I can remember on two occasions with paralyzed men that I remember one man, he'd been in a terrible accident and he had, in order to make him walk, because he was only maybe late 20s, they'd put steel pins in his knee and in his hip and in his ankle, so he couldn't bend his leg at all, he could only swing it. And I remember when I said to him, now I know God has healed you, kneel down. Now that was totally impossible. How could he kneel? Because he'd got steel pins in his knee, in his hip, in his ankle. He could not kneel. Oh yes, he did. And I remember he looked at me and I saw such an expression on his face and I thought he was so angry with me and he pulled back his fist. I thought he was going to hit me and knock me to the ground. Instead of that, he jumped up, put his arms around me and bounced me up and down like a baby. Why? Because an absolute miracle had occurred publicly in front of the people. So you see, God so often uses these healings as an evidence, just as he was going to do in the case of Moses, that he said, no, you're going to go to the head of the Egypt, the king, the Pharaoh, and he will refuse to do what you ask. But by the time I've demonstrated my power, yes, he will. He'll let you go. Now, do you see that what God is saying, and I feel that what God was saying to Moses, God is saying to us today, in a sense, that what we see as impossible, when we have the call, the commission, the command of God, and we go out, God says, I will demonstrate, I will do something, and as a result, the king will let you go. What I see here is if Moses had not responded and had simply said, well, we must acquiesce, we must give in, we must do what the Pharaoh says, Israel would have never left captivity in Egypt. And I'm concerned at the moment, very concerned over the situation, because I believe that even with some of the legislation that's being brought on us by the government, by our simple acceptance of it, it gives the government a sense of control over what we can do and say as Christians. And I do believe that we have to stand up and declare that our authority is from God.